Hi everybody, my name's John Franklin and I'm Head of Safety Promotion at EASA, and welcome to our Conversation Aviation podcast. This is the second in our podcast series and we're talking to all sorts of interesting guests, and today I'm really excited for this one because we've got Laura Watson, who's Seasonal Readiness Manager at easyJet. It sounds like a really interesting job title. Maybe you can start just by introducing yourself a little bit and tell us about what you do at easyJet.
Yeah, sure. So as you mentioned, I'm Laura Watson. I'm the Seasonal Readiness Manager at easyJet. I've been in the role for about a year and a half now, just under. And I think the role is a relatively new one at easyJet. It was from an evolution of the previous Winter Ops Manager role that was in place. And I guess that's from the appetite for seasonal readiness activities to extend just beyond the winter operation. So, and whilst I've had discussions previously on the seasonal part of my job title, given that really readiness is something that we should be looking at all year round, there are definitely some key risks that pop up every year around the same time that we can start planning for. And essentially that's what my role is at easyJet. So planning for those seasonal risks, ensuring that we're doing what we can to mitigate or minimise those where possible, and just making sure that we're ready to deliver a safe and efficient operation all year round, really.
It sounds really, and it was interesting because obviously we've been, we have lots of discussions about particularly what you do and your colleague Nick, how that feeds into our wider safety promotion plan. And particularly when we launched our Conversation Aviation magazine at the end of March, we did a sort of mindset seasonal readiness article in that, and the discussions we've been having, and particularly your role was a real inspiration for that. And kind of we find ourselves doing this at EASA, where we create a map of here are the safety risks for the industry, and it's really easy, well, not really easy, but because it's kind of obvious, but it's important to remember that all risks aren't the same all year, and that things change, and there are certain times of the year where certain things are really important, perhaps more than other times of the year. Yeah. And I think getting into that mindset, whatever size organisation you are, is really, it's kind of a key part of, as you say, keeping the operation safe from the start of the year to the end of the year. And I guess, in fact, that was one thing that, particularly we kind of we've been talking about quite a lot, is kind of almost at the start of the year, you're in this kind of just coming to the end of this winter period now. And, I know you've had, it's been like every year, there's lots of winter challenges that you face. And, what kind of things have you been dealing with kind of in this first part of the year from the kind of the winter part of the season so far then?
Yeah, I mean, absolutely. Winter operation is still a huge part of my role at the moment. So, and there really isn't much time that elapses between the end of a winter season and the planning of the next winter season. So I think it just shows that the amount of work that goes into ensuring that it's a safe and efficient operation during the winter is a mammoth task. So I think one of the challenges that we face going into this winter was very much the loss of experienced staff within the de-icing industry, and with that an influx of new staff coming in, and I think that's a knock-on effect that the pandemic is still having across the aviation industry. But we recognise that as one of our sort of key risks ahead of this winter season, and if you think about the de-icing task itself, de-icing an aircraft is a really technical skill, and obviously with most technical skills you can be taught and shown and have the right training, but experience can often be a key component in the efficiency of driving the efficiency of the operation. So we knew that the loss of experience would potentially pose a risk in this sense, but what we tried to do is mitigate any safety implications that loss of experience, influx of new staff would then have on the operation. So a lot of our readiness activities ahead of this winter weren't just focused on the number of people that our suppliers had, but those people were trained and competent to do the task, to sort of bridge that gap between inexperience and the task they were doing. So We stepped away from self-declarations ahead of this winter season, which was what we did historically within easyJet, where our suppliers would declare, yeah, we're ready, we've got this amount of people, we've got this amount of rigs and things like that. And we transitioned to a method, a show me, don't tell me method, and that's what we call it. It's an approach that we've started using. And essentially it does what it says on the tin. You know, our rather than our suppliers telling us the information and giving us the stats, it's more about, well, show me your recruitment plan, show me your training plan, show me your upskilling processes, showing people, you know, the resources that they've got, the allocation tools to essentially satisfy that we're all ready for winter. So when it came to the readiness of people, we sort of tasked our airport operations and contract managers, which are the guys and girls on the ground who look after the airports from a ground ops delivery perspective. And we tasked them with this approach to work collaboratively with the suppliers to delve into those processes and tools that they've got to make sure that the people that we had were trained and were ready, despite being sort of new to the industry. So that was one of the ways that we tried to sort of tackle that, rather than just looking at resourcing numbers, which can be a challenge in itself.
Yeah, I think it's a classic. We talk about that a lot in our analysis teams here, where, you know, it's, you look at pure performance indicators of I have enough of this and I have enough of that, but it's the kind of qualitative, what does that mean for the risk of the day-to-day operation? I think that's kind of that interesting next step that you've taken in the work that you're doing. So in terms of some of the trends, what kind of trends have you seen over the winter period this last few months then?
Sure. I mean, we're still actually de-icing. It's not actually officially over the winter.
Yeah, it's still. I had to wear my gloves cycling into the office this morning. It was -3 at one point this morning.
Oh, crikey. Yeah, absolutely. So we're still de-icing in some of our stations. So whilst the winter season isn't over just yet, we have seen a couple of trends come out from our safety sort of reporting system. One of them being communication between sort of flight deck de-icing provider. That communication between, are we ready for de-icing? Is the aircraft ready for de-icing? You know, and we've had a few issues where they may have started earlier than expected, or the communication just has broken down a little. We've also had some trends in terms of fluid contamination on areas where you shouldn't find it on an aircraft, essentially. So the sensitive areas of the aircraft, which fortunately hasn't caused any safety incidents, but the adverse effects of these things are generally delays for us, which is still not ideal. We want to get our passengers away to their destinations. So and I guess those kinds of delays also have other knock-on human factors type effects in the operation. It might not cause necessarily a safety problem now, but obviously, it's as well as the passenger element, it's the potential risk of that as well. Yeah, absolutely. Yeah. And I think while we can't sort of, we haven't analysed sort of a root cause for these trends as of yet, but I think experience could quite possibly be a contributory factor to these trends, with sort of the experience of the processes of the de-icing operation, experience in spraying and understanding the weather conditions, how that can affect the operation. So I think that the risk we identified prior to the winter season could have quite easily manifested itself in these sort of trends that we're seeing. So it will definitely be something we'll be looking at ahead of the next winter season, to figure out what else can we do to mitigate this and stop it happening again. And I guess yeah, and
I think that's one of the, in fact, maybe a good time to talk about like the planning for next year. And certainly one of the things we've already been talking about, you were saying about how it kind of 1 year rolls into the next, and I think a lot of people find it strange that why do we end up doing starting winter readiness potentially on the hottest day of the year. And I remember, I think it was last year's winter ops conference that you had with your suppliers and your network was pretty much on the hottest day of the year. But I think that's maybe an interesting thing to mention, that you do this every year, and it's something that starts that early in the year, so that everything's ready in that period of time it needs to be.
Yeah, absolutely. It's very ironic, isn't it, talking about snow when it's gorgeous sunshine outside. But yeah, we absolutely start those conversations in the summer. And I think that is generally how it happens across industry as well. We realise that we need that period of time to really nail down what we need to do ahead of the winter. And our Winter Ops conference / webinar in recent years has been running for over a decade now. And it's an event that we extend to many of our colleagues across the industry. So we extend the invite to other airlines, our de-icing service providers, the fluid manufacturers, equipment manufacturers, and it's always been a great opportunity to share learnings from the previous winter, share trends, see if anyone else is having the same issues, come together collaboratively to sort of discuss those and what we can do better for next year, but also look at the positive points of what's happened in a good way, and ultimately share the key safety messages ahead of the next winter. And I think that's one of the most important elements of that webinar, is that, we've discussed it previously, John, haven't we, about how many messages there are, how many safety messages we put out there. And ahead of the winter, if we can align those messages across industry and focus on some key points, it would be an achievement, I think, which is I guess a really good point to start introduce in this year's webinar.
And I think that's where it's maybe great to mention the fact that the plan this year is to have that cross-industry collaboration, and doing the winter readiness webinar as something we do together for the wider industry, and not just within the easyJet network. So it's great to have you and the team at easyJet collaborating with us on that. I can't wait to kind of really get started on that. So that's maybe one thing. Well, so maybe we look ahead now to the spring part of the year, and I know wildlife has been a huge it's where originally I connected with Nick and the ground ops team there at easyJet on the collaborations you were doing on wildlife hazard management. So maybe you could talk a little bit about some of the wildlife hazards that you're looking at for the next few months now.
Yeah, absolutely. So, as you mentioned, spring rolls around, and inevitably every year we see a spike in wildlife activity across most of the airports across the network, really. That rate sort of increases as we go into summer, then kind of plateaus and stays at a high level throughout the summer. So the risk for us is the increased strike rate, and then ultimately risk is damage to the aircraft, which could have sort of, quite severe consequences, as we've seen historically with some events in the past, but luckily not with us. But we recognise the importance of having an input into this risk. So while we don't manage it ourselves, because obviously it's airport responsibility to have the wildlife hazard management plans, we absolutely recognise the need for us as airlines to collaborate with the airports to sort of work towards the same goal. So we place huge importance on our airports having an effective wildlife hazard management plan, habitat management plan, and the execution of these plans as well. So each year around about this time, we ask our airport operations managers to sort of review the risks at their stations. So working with their airports to look at if the risk has changed, have they seen any extra species that have been arrived on the airfield, what kind of strikes have they been seeing, are they seeing damaging strikes, and what control measures have they got in place, and could these be fortified, could anything else be put in place to fortify those control measures on the airfield. So and I guess one of the ways that we are collaborating with our airports is that we contract a subject matter expert each year to sort of go out to some of our highest risk airports or our key airports in our network to share their knowledge. They've got a wealth of knowledge, and they've been to a lot of airports across the world, and we find it's a great way to get our airports engaging in that conversation and using the knowledge of our subject matter experts. So and it's been met with some really positive feedback from our airports to sort of have that collaborative approach, share learnings from other airports, what's going well, what's not, what could we do better, because ultimately climate has had a massive effect on that some airports have seen completely different species arrive that they haven't had sort of 10 years ago, and then they might not understand sort of what is necessarily needs to be put in place, but yeah, we're having those conversations, and it's a great way for us to engage and sort of have an impact on that risk, a risk that we don't specifically have control over. So
Yeah, and actually, having been at there was the wildlife hazard management event that I know easyJet and Wizz and I think Jet2 Volunteer and then also with Star Insurance put together in Prague a few years ago, and it was amazing to see how much the airports appreciated the airlines engaging with them on this topic. And I know, subsequently, having worked also with the wildlife hazard management experts that I know you work with, and actually together collectively we collaborated on a wildlife hazard management kind of best practice introduction guide, and the guide we created together was, it was really just an introduction. There's still a lot more that kind of technical stuff that the experts know that go far beyond that helps really make a difference. But I know it's that collaboration that's really changes the game in that context. And I think particularly for me, maybe one of the quick messages I would say particularly to other airlines is, while it is the importance of, if you've had a strike and you know which airport, it was perhaps on departure, or you had a strike at a particular place and then the aircraft returns to home base, to be able to report back to that airport with the information, so, because it's that full jigsaw of the picture that's so important for all of us, isn't it?
Absolutely. And I think that one of the key pieces of the puzzle that we focus on internally is the data collection. Without it, really, we have no real ability to assess the risk. The data collection that we receive, so where the strike happened, whether it was on airfield, off airfield, and especially species ID, it's something that I've been trying to drill into all of the departments in easyJet internally about how important it is to have that piece of information. It massively informs our risk assessments of where our riskiest stations are. You may have a station that has a lot of uncontrollable small bird species that have a lot of strikes on paper. However, the risk actually isn't quite potentially as high as a station that has larger bird species that have damaging strikes. So if we don't have these pieces of information, it can be very hard to know where to start to mitigate the risk. So it's one of the things I've been working with flight ops as well, to put the comms out into our internal magazine, just to sort of understand and help the pilot community understand the importance of accurate data capturing when we do have a strike.
Yeah, and I think that's probably one of the biggest messages I've taken from the work I've been doing collaboratively with everybody on wildlife hazard management. So I think that's a great one. And maybe if we look then ahead to the summer season and kind of other topics kind of beyond the wildlife season, what other kind of things are you looking at in terms of your own summer campaigns and things like that?
Yeah, sure. So I guess since the pandemic, the sort of a ramp up in operations has very much been on everyone's radar. And whilst last year was sort of the initial ramp up, each summer we inevitably do see the flying programme increase. So it's something that we are focusing on to ensure that we've got the right things in place to ensure that we're ready, or if we're not, we know well in advance so that we can try and do something about it. I think that's one of the key aspects to our readiness activities. And again, similar to winter, we kind of stepped away from a once in time readiness activity, a questionnaire to say, yeah, we'll be fine for summer, to something that's a continuous tracker of how we're performing throughout the summer. So we've got something in place now where we look at resource numbers, recruitment, training numbers and things like that for all of our key suppliers in essentially our top 30 airports and beyond. But we look at those items, as I said, as a way to trigger a risk if it does happen before, so that we can have time to put something in place. And also to engage with our suppliers, it's similar to the show me, don't tell me approach. That's absolutely critical for the summer, and the tracker kind of feeds into that. If we see something not quite right, we see that we are particularly down on headcount on a certain department for our ground operations, for example, we can have those conversations with our suppliers to say, can we see your recruitment funnel? When did you start your recruitment? Are your training lead times? Have you reviewed those and things like that? Having those conversations, I think, is becoming more and more valuable than just saying, yes, we've got X amount of people, we need X amount of people. Looking at the skill set, looking at the recruitment funnel has become really key in understanding where our pinch points might be this summer. Inevitably, there will be some, but if we can plan for them and we prepare for them and we know about them, we're in a better place than it's being a surprise, essentially. So
it's really interesting to hear the way you describe that, as we're preparing kind of our own generic summer kind of campaign, and we've come up with this year's theme being no compromise on safety, and particularly asking people, kind of inviting the industry to consider, and we use the phrase ready, resilient and responsive. And interestingly, that's exactly what you've just described. There's the readiness piece that shows you're prepared. There's the kind of going slightly deeper that kind of provides more of the resilience side of it, but then there's the continuous monitoring bit that, well, are we responsive, are we keeping an eye on what's changing, having those conversations with all the different suppliers and other people that you rely on to keep your operation on track and kind of keep all that going. So it's it's kind of exciting when we create something in our office here, and it shows that all of our discussions that we have with people like you and all the other organizations we work with kind of really helps to shape what we're doing here. And it's great to see how those are connected.
Yeah, absolutely. I think inevitably when we have the increase in flying, what we don't want to see is an impact on safety performance. Like you say, safety is absolutely the number one priority, and time pressures, we want to make sure that we're putting the right messages out to our suppliers as well, that safety is number one. And whilst we appreciate that the time pressures will increase over the summer ramp up, that it is important ultimately to ensure you've got safe operations. So similar to your summer campaign, we launched a summer campaign last year called Safety, Time and Procedures. And we picked those things, as we kind of said that those were the three pillars that we found that were the most important. Safety first every time, taking the time to do your job safely and following the procedures were ultimately the key messages we wanted to get out there. So we had a whirlwind tour of Europe last year where we visited our stations with some goodies with that sort of slogan on, and we plan to do the same this year, so that we're engaging with our frontline staff we received really great feedback last year from it, so we're doing exactly the same this year.
And I think that's the thing, is it's the more safety people we engage the frontline workforce in something more than just saying fill out a report when something bad happens, and they feel that they're connected with this kind of in their everyday jobs, really.
Absolutely. And I think just the simple thank you often goes a real long way. Thank you for doing your job safely and making sure this aircraft goes away safely. It really, I think that it's really appreciated when you're out there. Last year we were in places where they were working in extreme heat, and they still had a smile on their face. They were still, following the right procedures. They were doing a great job, and it was really great to see.
Yeah, I think that's such an important thing, isn't it? The way we connect with the frontline workforce. We sit in a nice air-conditioned office here in Cologne, and it's so important to see. We don't even have aviation out of the window, which is even harder. So it's making sure we keep this connection with the front line. I think is such a key thing, particularly at challenging times. And maybe just kind of for some last kind of points is, I know there's various other topics that I know challenge you throughout the year. Some of those, I particularly found it really interesting when we was talking about mobility aids, for example. Can you talk about some of those kind of other things that took me by surprise that perhaps other people might not have thought of?
Definitely. I think we're gradually seeing sort of trends come out, like seasonally, where we can sort of put these on a calendar and say, actually, this is more likely to happen at this time of year. But what we've seen certainly is an increase in the carriage of electric mobility aids at certain times of the year. So generally after the school holidays have finished, so we're looking at September to November, we actually saw at the beginning of this year, January, February, a similar issue. And I guess the risk that poses is the fact that, the increase in electric mobility aids increases the likelihood of maybe incorrect carriage, incorrect loading. There are a lot of EMAs out there at the moment, lots of models and makes, different batteries, and obviously carriage of batteries in the hold is another issue as well, but which could then lead to fire in the hold. So electric mobility aid carriage is something that we have put a lot of work into to ensure that the comms that our crews have, that our ICC department have, are correct in the way that everyone knows what to do when a certain EMA turns up at the aircraft. So we've done a sort of a flow chart on how to deal with certain batteries, how to load certain EMAs, what to do. We do see some safety reports coming in where, the incorrect loading or the battery hasn't been inhibited and things like that. But we've tried really hard to work on the comms to make them clear, easy to follow, so that there's no confusion on what to do when you are presented with an electric mobility aid to load into the aircraft. But and these kind of comms are the ones that we produce seasonally. So just before the EMA season, just before we see an increase in PRM passengers or a carriage of EMAs, these are the kind of comms that we will look to put out. So whilst it may not be a risk throughout the year, this is something that we'll then target just before we expect to see an increase in the carriage of EMAs.
And I think that shows that, the importance of that seasonal mindset. If you just put all the messages out all year, it just doesn't have the impact at the right moment in time. And I think that's the same. I know something else we've talked about is loading above the line, particularly on the ski season. I know that's another kind of similar challenge that you have as well.
Yeah, definitely. I think this is an Airbus specific one, but absolutely, the loading above the line. Every sort of ski season when we see an increase in hold baggage and larger hold baggage, we have the issue of baggage being over the line. So again, we focus our comms as and when we need to do that. And obviously focus comms in a way that we don't push it out to all of our stations, because not all of our stations have the same sort of winter traffic. So our ski season is it's very route specific, I guess, as well. Yeah, absolutely. So as well as being sort of seasonal, we look at where the focus needs to go across the network. So it's something that we keep an eye on when we look at the trends and we look at the reports coming in on what stations may need a little bit more focus in terms of comms to the staff. So similarly with high winds and sort of storm season, obviously it's a bit harder to predict now with climate change and the weather kind of being a little bit unpredictable throughout the year, but we certainly have times of the year where storms are more likely. So it's one of the things that we monitor, and if needed, put the comms out as and when we need to do that, because I think it's a really important thing to be doing, to put the reminder out, like you say, on the risks that are relevant at the time, rather than a whole bunch of messages that could get lost and not remembered at the right time when they're needed. So
I think that's fantastic. What a great way to finish that kind of discussion. I think it's such, it's something that in a situation where there's just almost not a million risks, but there's a huge number of risks to manage, is that seasonal element that you talk about and how you manage that really helps to kind of simplify things down to a level that people can actually understand in an operational context. Operational staff have so many things to worry about that having to worry about everything all of the time doesn't necessarily help. Whereas, as you say, the way you break it down in that seasonal mindset really helps to focus people's minds on the things they need to at whatever times of the year that it's really important. So I think it's a really great message to highlight, and a huge thanks for joining us on the podcast, and look forward to the further work on the winter ops conference planning and all the other things that we're hopefully going to continue to do over the next months and years together. So thanks for joining us, Laura, and for everybody else, keep an eye out for all our summer safety campaign material, and then we also have our safety week planned the week of the 30th of May to the 2nd of June. So we'll see you soon, and hopefully you'll be able to follow and listen to our podcasts over the next few months. And we've got lots of interesting guests to follow after this as well. Thanks very much. Take care and be safe, everybody.